Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us this evening for the second of our 3 high holiday dialogues with the faculty of Hadar Institute. Throughout the month of Elul, a time of learning and introspection before the high holidays, we'll discuss some of the major themes we encounter over the course of the holidays and how we can integrate new meaning into our worship and our rituals. Tonight's program will focus on the uniqueness and grandeur of the high holiday liturgy, and I'm totally delighted and honored to welcome our guest scholar here, Rabbi Elie Kaunfer. Rabbi Kaunfer is president and CEO of the Hadar Institute. A graduate of Harvard College, he completed his doctorate in liturgy at the Jewish Theological Seminary, where he was also ordained. Elie is a co-founder of the independent minyan Kehilat Hadar and has been named multiple times to Newsweek's list of 50 top rabbis in America. Welcome, Rabbi Kaunfer. It's a total pleasure to have you joining us here this evening.
I'm honored to be with you.
Great. And you all should know that Elie and I have known each other a long time, so it really is a pleasure to be here in dialogue with him.
Thank you.
So let's start with the basics. A lot of people come to high holiday services, and they don't come to services much throughout the year. So they come because they're coming with family, it's because it's the thing to do on the high holidays, because they have family traditions. All are great reasons for showing up for services. And then they encounter a lot of prayer. And for many, prayer isn't so easy, either because they don't know Hebrew, or they look at the language and the translation, and the sort of ancient language of our liturgy doesn't always resonate with people. So let's start with, how can people get into prayer if it's not something that they have done a lot of and might know well?
Great. So first of all, I think the situation that you described is almost universal in American Jewish life, except for a few pockets. And so there are many, many people who are struggling with encountering the liturgy on high holidays, or if you show up to Shabbat for a bar bat mitzvah or something like that, you're always sort of encountering this set of words that you might not necessarily connect to. So I'm excited to talk about how we might connect to these words and how much they can be powerful. But I would just start off by saying there are moments for a lot of people where, okay, let's say 80% of the liturgical experience is sort of passing you by. But we all might have those little moments that we're looking forward to, whether it's a melody or Avinu Malkeinu, or the Ark is opening, or just a moment of silent reflection. And I would just encourage people to lean into that, meaning it's not a situation where you have to be 100% plugged in and you're even expected to be 100% plugged in all the time. But there are moments of sort of peaks and to just acknowledge that, yeah, I'm looking forward to that rendition of Elenu or whatever it is, and just to experience that as something. I'll just note that the rabbis in the Talmud discuss their own struggles with what they call kavanah, with intention or connection to tefillah. And some of them admit, I never once had intention in my entire life. Another rabbi says, I used to count bricks in the wall. And another one says, I used to count clouds in the sky. So the idea that we might lose focus or not necessarily connect every word in the liturgy is age-old and doesn't only impact lay people. Also, rabbis have challenges around this. And we're going to spend some time unpacking some of the ways in which we could connect deeper, but I just want to acknowledge that this is an age-old question that people are struggling with.
That's great. It reminds me of sometimes we look around and we look at the ceiling in the sanctuary, or we look at the names. So it's like counting bricks or looking at clouds, right? So, and I hope that gives people some comfort that even the rabbis have trouble connecting at times. So that's great. Thank you for sharing that. So I would say another barrier that I know that people encounter is God. Right? There's a lot of God language in services, and especially in the high holidays. And a lot of people, a lot of Jews are, let's face it, agnostic, maybe even atheist, or just struggle with the concept of God. So do you have any suggestions for how to get over the God stumbling block as we think about the liturgy?
Great. Thank you for raising that question. I think a lot of people struggle with that, maybe not necessarily openly in synagogue, but it's something even as you know, rabbis struggle with as well. I sort of approach that question on two fronts. One, I think there are moments of the liturgy which, although it certainly was designed for a theistic population, people who do believe in God, there are lines and moments in which anybody who's committed to improving the world or a vision of justice that is not necessarily our current world, can find some inspiration in the lines of the liturgy. And I'll just give you an example about that, which comes in every prayer service that we recite, and also on the high holidays. We recite sort of the main rabbinic prayer called the Amida, the standing prayer. And the first blessing of that prayer includes the line, Ha'el Hagadol Hagibor V'Hanora, the great, mighty, and awesome God. Now, if you're not really into the God thing, that line could be a stumbling block. Like, why do I need to praise God and heap all these adjectives onto a God that may or may not be in my consciousness? But the truth is, when you look at the context of that line, which is just a quote from the Torah, you'll see that when God is called great, mighty, and awesome, although you might expect that God is great, mighty, and awesome because that God created the world or split the sea or did this or that miracle, things that you and I can't do, the truth is, in that particular passage in Deuteronomy, God is called great, mighty, and awesome because God takes care of the widow, orphan, and stranger. And not just this is something that God does, but the Torah goes on to say, you too must love the stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. So when I hear that line, the great, mighty, and awesome God, what I might think about is, how am I loving the stranger? How am I supporting the most vulnerable members of society, the widow and the orphan, as it were? And I may or may not bring God into that conversation with me, but the obligation for me to worry about the vulnerable members of society stands with or without your connection to God. So that's just one piece I think that we might be able to connect to some of the justice language of the liturgy, even if we're not connecting to the God part of that.
Which is why this conversation, I think, is so critical, because people don't know that, right? So when you know the background and you know the context, and you can look at that language and go, oh, this is I'm supposed to act in the ways that God does. So this is my challenge to myself, right? With or without the God. So just, I feel like giving people the education and the opportunity to understand more gives everybody the opportunity to participate and be involved and engaged more.
Yeah, and I'll just say on that note, the entire liturgy is essentially a pastiche, sort of a re-scrambling of lines from the Bible. And so even the most educated worshipers who are really into it don't always know the context of the lines that they're saying. And there's so much meaning to be mined when you do look at the context. And you can go in multiple directions, and maybe we'll spend some time doing that with a few lines from the liturgy. But just to note, generally, there's so much more than what's on the page, and certainly what's on the translation side of the page. Because you can't just translate a line and say, God is great, mighty, and awesome. That's like, okay, is God great, mighty? Do I experience God as great, mighty, and awesome? No, it's really actually a quote that has a larger context, and that can take you in other directions. I did want to say one thing also, just in terms of, what if I do believe in God? Like, it might not be popular, in this particular context, but I would say, like, I have a relationship with God, a personal relationship with God, and I think that a lot of us also, I would say, you said, we're in the atheist or maybe agnostic side. If you take agnosticism seriously, it's like, I'm not sure, not I deny. And for a lot of Jews, that's where we are. And so I want to just open up another image that I think might be helpful for people who are looking to connect to God. And that's to explore just for a moment God's name in the liturgy. Now, what's amazing about Jewish liturgy is they could have gone down a path of saying, God's name is so holy, we're not going to use it at all in our prayers. We're just going to use a euphemism. And they sort of cut it both ways, because indeed, we don't pronounce God's four-letter name that's spelled in the Siddur, Yud, He, Vav, He in the Hebrew letters, or if you're going to transliterate it, YHVH, which doesn't sound like anything. We can't even really pronounce it. I mean, the Jehovah's Witnesses have their theory of how to pronounce it, but we're in the Jewish tradition not pronouncing that name, so it is special and set aside. Nevertheless, it shows up in all of our prayers. Like, we don't just say, oh, this name is too holy, we're not gonna use it. And what is the meaning of that name, Yud, He, Vav, He? So it seems to be some scrambled version of to be, right? Yihiyeh would be to be. And that's sort of like God is all being or all present or past, present, and future. And there's something sort of nice about thinking about God transcending time. I want to offer one other context for those who are trying to connect to God as a being and not just as an idea. So in the context of where God introduces God's self to Moses in the Bible, Moses said, what's your name? Like, how am I supposed to introduce you to the Israelites who I'm going to go redeem? And God says, this is my name, Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh. I am that I am, or I will be that I will be, is how it's often translated. But the interesting thing about Ehyeh, which is just like a first-person conjugation of Yud He Vav He, like God is saying, I will be, as opposed to God will be, he will be. So what does Ehyeh mean, I will be? Every other time the word shows up in the Torah, first of all, only God says it. So a human doesn't say, I'll be there in 5 minutes. That's not a line that you see in the Torah. Only God says, Ehyeh, I will be. And every time it's mentioned, it says, I will be with you, or with your mouth, or with my people. In other words, I will be is not just I exist, but it's I will be with you. I am connecting to you. So every time we say God's name, the sort of core meaning of that, just contextually in the Torah, is I want to acknowledge how God is with me. God is not separate and removed and out there and inaccessible and completely transcendent. God is immanent. God is part of my life, and we're trying to connect to each other. That's what I take with that particular name of God.
Again, it's so important to understand the meaning behind and the context, because it's God in relationship. So every time we say Yud He Vav He, it's God in relationship with us. As you said, it's an intimate relationship with God. Which is not, and when you think about what you started with, Ha'el, Hagibor, V'Hanora, like that, we think of that as like very transcendent, right?
Far away,
far
great
away,
and mighty,
exactly,
beyond my
exactly.
comprehension.
I happen to have a relationship with that kind of God, but what you've just done is explain how that should reflect on us, and then also like think about God in like relationship with us.
Yeah.
So it's already like a great first 10 minutes is amazing in terms of getting people inside and having people access what they just may not know, or probably don't know, actually.
Yeah, and I know we're going to talk about Yom Kippur, but just to sort of foreshadow a little bit, we think often of God on Yom Kippur as that judging God, the God who is going to strike us down for our sins. I'm not saying there's no language or imagery around that portrayal of God in our liturgy, but also there's that intimate side of Yom Kippur is the day in which we reconnect to God. You think about, on a human level, if you and I have a fight, this is the moment in which we make up, which is just a relationship strengthening moment. And so if you think of Yom Kippur as God and the Jewish people making up, as it were, there's an end game there in which our relationship is deeper and stronger at the end of the day. So I think that's part of what we're trying to aim for in the high holidays, is walking out with a sense of we have a deeper bond between us and God.
That's great. It's a beautiful aspiration for people to think about as they enter the high holidays too. So one of the other things you recently published an article in this wonderful journal called Kol Nidre, called Approaching God Through Sound, Not Translation. And it was fascinating, and I think really compelling also for a lot of people. As we're talking about like how to access services and how to access God, not through translation, but through sound in different ways. So do you want to share a little bit of what your insight was in this?
Yeah, so I appreciate you holding up. This is the Hadar High Holiday Reader, which you can just Google that online, and you can read these essays directly, and you can get a printed version as well. But what I was exploring in that essay is this disconnect between the meaning of the words of Kol Nidre, that prayer or sort of recitation that we start off Yom Kippur with at night, that is so different from people's emotional connection to those words. If you just sort of wander your eye over to the translation side of the prayer book and read what is Kol Nidre asking for, it's in some ways a technical resolution of promises, either that I made last year that I want to undo, or that I'm about to make for this coming year that I want to sort of in advance undo. And there's not a lot that's sort of religiously inspiring about that. It's almost like a contractual, clause that you're going to start off the evening with, which isn't particularly moving for a lot of people.
Right. It's an annulment of our vows, right?
Exactly,
right.
Which might be necessary as a sort of business precaution, but not necessarily a weepy moment of emotion. But of course, so many of us experience a deep connection to those words, what I was arguing, not because of their translated meaning, but because of the way in which we hear the sounds of those words and the music that goes along with it. one of the interesting things about Kol Nidre is just the rhyme scheme. Kol Nidre, V'esareh, V'charameh, V'chinuye, V'kinuse. There's a sort of ba-ba-ba, ba-ba-ba. There's a meter and a ending to each of the words, which might sort of, in a non-cognitive way, get us to connect with a certain mantric moment that we are entering our prayer experience with. And that is, I would say, heightened by the music that you hear in most Ashkenazi synagogues. It's sort of like a traditional tune that sort of in some ways strikes some level of fear or seriousness into our consciousness. Oh, Yom Kippur's starting. That's the sort of the meaning of that musical moment. But I should say that even before that musical motif was written, Jews always connected to Kol Nidre. And interestingly, the rabbis were very opposed to Kol Nidre. They didn't like it to be part of the service. They wanted to strike it down. It seems like, why should I annul my vows? That's not something I really want to get behind. But the sort of popular Jewish experience of Kol Nidre was like, I love this so much, I'm not going to let you take it away from me. And so it's always been there once it sort of emerges, about 1,200 years ago. And so if you find yourself on Kol Nidre night saying, you know what, I don't know what these words mean, but I'm actually having a moment, I think in some ways that's how it even might have been designed. If you want to say, I annul my vows, you could have had a much shorter formula. I annul my vows, the end. But when we're getting to words that are synonyms and repetition, and we say the whole thing in traditional services 3 times, that's sort of, we're moving beyond the cognitive to a sort of affective experience of the words and the sounds and the music that might accompany that. And so I'm just giving permission to people who have a connection to those sounds and not necessarily the meaning of the words to sort of lean into that as well and say, yeah, I love how that sounds. A similar thing happened with the Kaddish. In 19th century Germany, the enlightened Jewish community in Germany said, why are we reciting the Kaddish, this Aramaic prayer that nobody understands? Let's translate it into German and recite it in German. And they recited it in German. Everybody basically said, I don't like it in German. I'd rather have it in Aramaic, even if I don't understand it, because it just sounds better. So there's sometimes we have Jewish prayer where the sound, I think, is the chief experience you're supposed to have. And the translation is like a distant second.
Which is nice. So we can invite people to not even read the translation, but just emotionally be present at services and see what resonates, both musically, but also, like you said, it's like a mantra.
Yeah.
And you wrote an article once about like prayer as poetry, but like it's the same way. It's like the meter and the rhyme, right? So sometimes poetry takes us away, like transcends us or transports us because it's like the meter and the rhyme, and it's not just about the words.
Exactly.
So,
for those who are poetry lovers, it's like there's so much to the experience of reading a poem, even the visual layout of the poem, that is so beyond like, what does this poem mean? Like I'm reading the newspaper, give me the message. For those of us who like prose, you'd be like, why did you make that so complicated? Just say what you mean. But that is actually not what prayer is. Prayer is not a credo. Prayer is not a paragraph. Sometimes you have paragraphs in prayer, but fundamentally the mood of prayer, I think, is poetic. And so there's all those other aspects of what you might connect to in a poem, the meter, the length, the word choice, the music that it's set to, that is meant to give you an experience beyond the translation.
Right, which is great. It's like it's a think of it as metaphor a lot, right? And not get so hung up on the words necessarily.
Yeah, or to say the words are a window into something broader and not a one-to-one correlation with a specific meaning.
Right, which is great. And of course, the music is also something that, as you said, Kol Nidre especially, like think the jazz singer. But so that is certainly something that is recognizable. I hear a lot of times, even my daughter, so she went to college and she went to Hillel, and after Rosh Hashanah, she called me, they used all different tunes, which is like, she's like, how can I enjoy services? The tunes were all different.
Right, I used to say that if you don't hear your Avinu Malkeinu tune, you should get your money back, You're here for the melodies, and if they don't do the melodies, it's not working for you.
Right, but, and which is like challenging, I think, for our cantors, because they also want to keep things interesting and different places have different traditions, but there's also something musically about just connecting to your past, right? Like, it's the tune I grew up with, and even if I don't understand the prayers, and even if I don't understand the words, the music connects me to my tradition, to my family, to traditions before, which is also a way to just sort of lean into prayer without having to get too caught up in translation.
Yeah, and it's funny actually, just the relationship that we have to music, I think in some ways is the relationship that many rabbis have to prayer. In other words, if I show up to services and they did a totally different number for Kol Nidre, you would be like, what just happened? I showed up for this tradition that I had, my parents had, or whatever my sort of connection to that melody is. If it's not there, it's missing. And I would say that's in some ways the way rabbis relate to the words of the prayer book. It's like, hey, you might be able to write something better, more contemporary, but fundamentally, a lot of this is about what am I coming back to? What's the sort of history and connection here to these words? And let's not monkey with them so fast. And so, I think on the melody front, there is a tension, as you say, like, can't just want to do something new. And so somebody wrote that melody to Kol Nidre, and it was new at some point. Right. And so we had to let it in. And so I do want to sort of encourage us to be open-minded when you hear a new melody, but you have to have the right balance between the new and the old, and I think that's probably true about our liturgy as well.
Right, and as you say, a lot of people don't realize or didn't know until they heard tonight's program that a lot of our liturgy comes from the Tanakh, right, from the Torah and from other parts of our Bible, and the structure of the prayer service is actually quite old and traditional too. So there's something nice about the fact that our parents, our grandparents, our great-grandparents said many of these same prayers and not messing with it too much because it links us in the chain of tradition too.
Exactly. Yeah, I think one of the most moving descriptions of what's meaningful for someone in prayer is when they tell you, well, this Siddur, this prayer book, was used by my grandmother, and I see her lipstick stain on this page, where she kissed the book and closed the cover. At that point, you're like, it doesn't matter what the words are. It's like, totally. in that moment, it's like I'm connecting to my grandmother and her experience of saying these words. And that is a very special dimension to a traditional set of words that are preserved in a physical book.
Wow, I haven't heard that's beautiful. So let's get a little more granular about the high holidays now. And to use a line from a different holiday, why are these prayers different than all other prayers? Or are they? So, how is the high holiday liturgy similar to and different from our regular Shabbat or other holiday services?
Yeah, so it's a great question because it also helps contextualize what are we even doing in these prayers that, frankly, take a long time to recite. Even as we've slimmed them down in some communities, they're nevertheless, when you tell other people of other faiths, it was a very fast service. We got done in 3.5 hours. They're like, what are you talking about? But so why are there so many words, and where are they coming from? So the fundamental starting point is to say that prayer is meant to be recited every day by a tradition that goes back already at least 2,000 years. And so when you come to synagogue on Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur, you're looking at a layered prayer book, something that's layered on your regular daily prayer. So, every day, 3 times a day, a Jew is supposed to recite the Amida, the standing prayer we mentioned a few minutes ago. And so the structure of that prayer is going to change depending on the day, but the fundamental sort of position of the prayer is the same. So on Rosh Hashanah, you will have a unique experience of that standing prayer where in the main sort of additional service that you add for Rosh Hashanah, you will have your standard 3 blessings in the beginning, including that line that we said before, the great, mighty, and awesome God. That's always going to be there no matter what day you say that prayer. So you have 3 blessings in the beginning, 3 blessings at the end. In the middle, you have special 3 blessings that are only recited on Rosh Hashanah. And those, you might remember from previous years, we talk about Malchiyot, Zichronot, and Shofar. Malchiyot, God's kingship. We can speak a little bit about how we might connect to God as king. I know that was also discussed in this series elsewhere. Zichronot, what does God remember? And Shofarot, the sounding of that blast, talk about a non-cognitive sound experience. That's unique to Rosh Hashanah, but it's set on a base of something that's standard and recited every day. So for a lot of the liturgy that we recite on the high holidays, there's sort of like your standard, let's call it 70% standard that you're going to recite no matter when you go to synagogue any day of the year. And then there's sort of shifting and changing about 30% of it. So if you're somebody who does pray every day, when you show up on Rosh Hashanah, you're like, I see the difference between my regular prayer service and today, and the today stuff really stands out. If all you do is ever show up on Rosh Hashanah, then you're not really comparing it to stuff that is your sort of regular prayer, and so it all sounds new and different. But just the structure of that experience is one in which we're taking like a 70% base and tweaking only 30% of it, but a lot of it is sort of like standard everyday stuff that we're layering on top of.
Right, but when you say tweaking, it's actually adding, right? Because it lengthens the service, right? So I like to say the rabbis continue to add stuff, and they forgot to take stuff out at the same time.
It's true, and a lot of the addition is actually poetry, like explicitly poetry.
Right.
That we maybe will dive into a few lines of that, but like, you know, Unatana Tokef, the who shall live and who shall die famous prayer, that's just a poem that's inserted into the regular structure of the Amida. And so, yes, it gets longer and longer as the Jewish tradition to write poetry for special days, and of course Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur were highlight special days, that means that you're going to spend more and more time hearing those poems on top of the regular liturgy. And so maybe a 30% tweak ends up at the end of the day being a 60% tweak because they added a whole bunch of stuff on top of it.
Right. But I think that what you do is, what you've exposed for people is the fact that a lot of people don't understand that the services are actually highly structured, that there's a skeleton that is the same in terms of like the Shema and the Amida, like there's certain pieces that are constant in our services and that there's an actual order to the services. And then there's just these additions or these tweaks.
Exactly. You know, you may have engaged in the game of how many more pages are left until the end of this service. And that indeed is something that sort of like what you're marking there is time based on page numbers, but you could also do that structurally. You sort of say, oh, when we get to the end of the Amida, when the leader is bowing at the end of the Amida, I know I've reached a certain marker point. And so indeed, it's a highly structured endeavor that, you know, for the initiated, you don't even have to notice what page you're on, and to do the countdown, you can just say, oh, we're at this bowing point, so I know how much is left. I'll just point out one example of where we might not necessarily notice there's a structural element, but it's always showing up this way. The prayer Avinu Malkeinu. We mentioned the melody around Avinu Malkeinu. Avinu Malkeinu is a prayer that's always recited after the Amida. And we can talk about the story that stands behind that, but so just structurally.
Avinu Malkeinu is the one that's like our Father, our Sovereign, right?
Correct.
So, and there's different tunes. So Avinu, like I just to give people a sense of Malkeinu, right? Just to give people a sense of what we're talking about, for not everyone will know. So continue. Sorry.
Yeah, so that's not randomly recited, you know, sort of whenever it feels like you want to say it. It is a prayer that's recited at the end of the standing prayer, at the end of the Amida, at the end of sort of the main bulk of each of the services on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. And the reason it's there, interestingly enough, is because in the Talmud, this prayer, Avinu Malkeinu, our Father, our King, is sort of a plan B. If plan A is like the Amida, like the standing prayer, the official prayer, the prayer we're all supposed to recite, and we say it silently, and then we repeat it, and there's bowing and all that, that's supposed to achieve something. But in the Talmud, we have a story in which that prayer didn't achieve its goal. And so another rabbi stood up and said, Avinu Malkeinu, our Father, our King, we have no king except for you. Avinu Malkeinu, our Father, our King, have mercy on us. Like 11 words in the Hebrew. And it achieved the result in that story. And so Avinu Malkeinu shows up at the end of our Amida as sort of like, gosh, did the Amida work? I'm not sure. Let's try this other prayer. It gets codified into our prayer book, but it was originally something that was sort of like, I'm not sure if this prayer was working. Let's try this other prayer and see if that works. And so you'll always find it at the end of the Amida. So in that way, it's sort of like structurally located, but also there's sort of a meaning to the structure. It's like a backup prayer when the main prayer wasn't working.
I love it. It's like we call it belt and suspenders, right? Yeah, it's great. And it's a wonderful story. Again, so now when people get to Avinu Malkeinu, I hope that they remember that and think, you know, this is the plan B, this is the backup, it's the extra.
I can tell you the story if you want to hear it.
Yeah, for sure.
So it's an amazing story. Actually, it doesn't take place on Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur, interestingly enough. It takes place in an emergency moment in the communal life. We think about our community struggling with COVID. In that community, they're struggling with drought. And in a drought that lasts for weeks and weeks and months, you're really scared about how are you going to eat this coming year. So part of the way the rabbis in the Talmud dealt with drought is they said, we're going to have a public prayer service. We're going to ask God for rain. So they would wheel out their best davener, their best prayer leader, their number one rabbi. In this story, it was Rabbi Eliezer, one of the famous rabbis of the Talmud. And he recites this Amida, this extra special version of the daily prayer where they add 6 extra blessings to ask God for rain. And recites this prayer, no rain comes. in this highly dramatic moment, his student named Rabbi Akiva stands up without being invited, just stands up and blurts out, Avinu Malkeinu, Ein Lanu Melech Ela Ata, Avinu Malkeinu Rachem Elenu. Our Father, our King, we have no king but you. Our Father, our King, have mercy on us. And guess what? The rain falls immediately. So you have this powerful experience in which the sort of older generation, Rabbi Eliezer, sort of does the scripted version of what you're supposed to do with no result. And then the younger student sort of gets up and says, let me try something new here, says this 11-word prayer, and the result is achieved. The rain falls. And then you have this moving interchange between Rabbi Akiva, the student, and the crowd. The crowd, as you can imagine, says,
Goes wild.
Yeah, they go wild. They're like, forget Rabbi Eliezer. Right. You're hired, Rabbi Akiva. Right, and Rabbi Akiva says, we don't want to disparage Rabbi Eliezer. Essentially, I'm doing something emergency, but you got to hold on to the tradition and to our teachers, even as I got the result. And there are different versions of that story in different parts of our Talmudic tradition. But fundamentally, what you have is this tension between, are we going to go with the old tried and true liturgy, which sometimes works and sometimes doesn't, and we're going to go with our tried and true leader, who sometimes is awesome and sometimes isn't, or we're going to go with the upstart student, who sometimes doesn't get the job done, but sometimes does. Are we going to try something new liturgically, which sometimes sounds weird, but sometimes is amazing? Now, where we end up on that in our liturgy is, let's do them both every year, all the time. And not only that, we're going to take Avinu Malkeinu and take it from an 11-word prayer and go like many, many lines of our Father, our King. Interestingly enough, that prayer expands over the years and in the Middle Ages as well. And one of the lines that was added in the Middle Ages is, Avinu Malkeinu, our Father, our King, minam magefa minachlatecha, prevent a plague from those who are your people. And more modern liturgies took that out in the last 30 or 40 years because they were like, plague, that sounds so medieval, wow. Let's just remove that and make the prayer services a little shorter, which sounded great until a few years ago. And now it's sort of like people are adding it back in because it's like, maybe we should be praying about plague again.
Right.
So you always have this tension of, am I going to preserve the old or am I going to try something new? Am I going with the teacher? Am I going with the upstart student? A lot of that is sort of playing around in our tradition, and you see it in that moment of the Amida leading into Avinu Malkeinu in our
And what I love about that story is the tension between the old and the new. So of course what we do is, we codify it and just add it, which is one of the reasons the services get longer. So, but it's also, it feels like it was Rabbi Akiva's personal prayer, right? And it gives us permission, sometimes what we need is personal prayer is what we need, and our structured prayers are great, but the fact that it was because of that sort of that personal sense of relationship with God that was the thing that actually had effect.
And if I could just say a word on the personal prayer aspect, we sometimes get, even the most educated on liturgy, sometimes get lost in the words that are in the book and forget that at least as the rabbis conceived of these prayers, they always had the idea that everybody was going to add their own personal prayer. In other words, the rabbis themselves never imagined a world in which all you did was show up to synagogue, recite or space out during the set words, and go home. Everybody was always meant to add their own personal prayer, otherwise it didn't make any sense. What is prayer without your own personal longings and desires and needs that are expressed in words? And that's why the prayer is recited silently in certain moments, because it's not a scripted liturgical moment that everybody knows the words to. It's like only you know the words to your own private prayer. So if you ever find yourself saying these words aren't working for me, I'd like to say something on my own, I would say that is part of the DNA of Jewish prayer, and it's not like you're breaking from tradition. You're actually just enacting what is meant to be done. Now, ironically, the Talmud reports private personal prayers of certain rabbis, and then in our prayer books, they codify those private personal prayers, and then it's like, not only am I saying the scripted public prayer, but I'm also saying this rabbi's private prayer, and then you might sort of lose the ability to say, well, actually, I'm supposed to say some of my own, my personal prayers. But again, the rabbis always imagined that you would be doing that, and that's a big part of what public liturgy is. It's sort of a goalpost, a sort of a marker in which in the spaces in between, you say your own version of what's bothering you or what you want to be talking about.
Which is, I want to sort of go back to where we opened, which is one of the things that services can do, even if you don't know the Hebrew and can't access the liturgy, it gives you a space and a time to try to find your own personal prayer, right? Like, we're so busy in our lives and running around, but I enter synagogue, it's a place of difference, right? It's a place that I'm setting aside my daily life, and so it's a way to invite people to find a way, whatever it is. So if you don't get so hung up on the words on the page, if you don't know the words on the page, what are the words in your heart that you feel that you need to access in that day?
Yeah, and I think both of those aspects have power. Like, if all you did was show up at services, take in the grandeur of the site, and then say your personal prayer, you'd be missing some of the communal experience that only a set liturgy can provide you with. But if all you did, on the flip side, is show up, recite a bunch of melodies, and go home, then you'd also be missing some of that personal level of it. And we talked about the rabbi who struggled with intention and counted bricks or counted clouds. I often think about what happened after the counting. Because like sometimes counting can get you to a meditative state where you're like, now I'm relaxed, I'm grounded, and I can say what I came here to say. So, sometimes it's like, yeah, I heard Avinu Malkeinu, I heard Kol Nidre, I heard the Shofar blast, and now I'm ready to say what I came here to say. Mm-hmm. And that can't just necessarily show up in the first 5 minutes of being in synagogue. It might take some settling in.
Right.
And that's part of the power of setting aside that time. It takes us a while to sort of slow down our brains and not look at our phones and, just be in a space where we might access the words of our heart. We often say, like, well, don't worry about the words in the page, say the words in your heart. And you're like, I don't have any words in my heart.
Right.
How am I supposed to get words in my heart?
Right.
And part of that sort of bubbling up of the words in your heart might come from the settling into the liturgy, that's sort of the container for that emotional moment in which you can finally deep dive into your own experience.
Right, which is what actually the rabbis in the sort of structure of the standard prayers realized, because we have our early prayers are actually the warm-up prayers before we get to the good stuff, right? In general, so
that's right. I would say in a non-modern way of thinking about structure, the center of the prayer book is actually usually the most important. So when you think about reading a newspaper article, the most important is the first paragraph, and it sort of descends from there. And if all you have time to do is read the first 5 paragraphs, you're going to get the main idea. A prayer book is not laid out that way. If you show up in the beginning and also at the end, that's actually not the most important part of the prayer. The most important part of the prayer service is in the middle. And so ironically, like if you show up really, really late for services, all you get is the last 20 minutes or something. I don't know anyone who would ever do that. So you're getting some sort of like, yeah, that's like a tack on aspect, but it's not like the main highlight. And similarly, if you showed up right on time, which I do encourage people to do, nevertheless, if you're right there at the beginning of the prayer service, that also isn't the most important part of the prayer service. The most important part is smack in the middle. And that's an ancient way of thinking about text and not a modern way of thinking about text. So yeah, it takes some time to get there, and they don't start off with the most important stuff. And also takes some warm down time, and that's what we have as we proceed to the end. But the middle part is really the main experience.
Great. So let's do a little bit of a deeper dive into some of the themes of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. So maybe you want to take like 1 or 2 themes of Rosh Hashanah that you want to sort of go deeply on?
Sure. So let's talk about God as King. Malchuyot, the middle section of the Amida on Rosh Hashanah. And part of the challenge we have, even in that prayer, Avinu Malkeinu we were speaking about, you translated it as our sovereign. That's sort of like sometimes like modern speak for, I don't like the word king, and so I'm going to go with sovereign because Americans don't like kings because we rebelled against the King of England. And so like the word king has a lot of experiences for us that are negative, and sovereign also, like, I'm not sure, maybe it's better, maybe it's not. The point is that, if you're not getting into the metaphor of God as Melech, God as king or sovereign or sort of supreme leader, then Rosh Hashanah can be hard, because a lot of Rosh Hashanah is, in fact, coronating God as king. A lot of the backstory to the poems on Rosh Hashanah is God is now king again. And actually the sort of hopeful experience of God as king is one in which not only the Jewish people experience God as king, but God's sort of moral power extends well beyond the Jewish people to sort of idealistic future in which everybody, Bayomahu, on that future day, everybody's going to call God king. And so you're sort of play acting a world in which, imagine if everybody lined up on the moral guideline of sort of the ultimate king, and what would our world look like in that scenario. So that's sort of the hopeful side of Rosh Hashanah. It's not just the day of judgment and the writing you in the book of life or not, but also imagining a world in which God's moral power stands for many more people than we experience today. And I would say, to the extent that, like me, you might look at the word king and say, but all the human kings that I know of, I have a complicated relationship to. And you think of sort of despots and, petty-minded authoritarian rulers. And what does it mean to take God and sort of map that metaphor onto God? So the rabbis had a similar nervousness about human kings. And in fact, in a number of midrashim, in a number of legends about describing God, said, whenever you think of human king, God is not an extreme version of that king, but rather the opposite of that king. In other words, take a human king, invert all of the experiences and characteristics of that human king, that's God. One of the great sort of examples of the rabbis doing that is a play on words in one of the poems in the Bible, one of the Psalms, that starts off Laminatseach, for the leader or for the conductor. It's one of the ways in which our Psalms start off often. But the rabbis read this word, linatseach, as victor. So you could imagine a psalm for the victor. And a king, a human king, might love that psalm. Oh, I'm the victor. I just came back from war. I'm a battle hero, and now they're going to sing a psalm to me. The rabbis say that's not how God experiences that. They actually turn it into the passive, and they say, this is not for the victor, but for the vanquished. And they say the following. They say, human kings, they love to win. They hate losing. But God is the opposite. God loves to lose. What's the example of God losing? God, in God's anger, wants to destroy the Jewish people after they sin with the golden calf. And Moses stands in the breach and says, I want you, God, to change your mind. I want you to forgive the Jewish people. And God is vanquished by Moses. God loves losing to Moses because God's anger is conquered by Moses. So if you think of a king, a human king doesn't like losing. A human king doesn't like being convinced to stand down. But God's the opposite. God loves forgiving. And God wants to be beaten. God's anger wants to be beaten back by God's mercy. And so you think of like all the images of king that we're saying on Rosh Hashanah, whatever you have in your mind as a human king, invert that. And that's the king that we're praying to.
That's super helpful in two respects, because one is my experience in teaching people grow up with this concept of this image of God as this cruel, punishing God. For some reason, a lot of people have grown up with the cruel, punishing God and not the loving, kind God. So it's super helpful for people to hear that. And on Rosh Hashanah and on the high holidays, we ask God to go from the seat of Din, of judgment, to the seat of Rachamim, of mercy, right? So we're asking that. But I love this image of thinking of God Bayom Hahu, like this sort of like this vision of it not being the king like a king of flesh and blood, but a king that will like have the whole world will then bow down to this concept of the ethical compass, right, that God is supposed to represent. And so it's a very different image of God. And I think that will be super helpful for people as they encounter all this.
Yeah. One of the other ways in which I think about that is, who do you want God to judge on the day of judgment? When we think of God judging us, we're like, oh, I don't like the judgy God.
Right,
judgmental God doesn't work for me.
Right.
But could you imagine a world in which God is judging the sort of immoral, despotic rulers? One of the lines in Untitled Chapter, that famous prayer in which we say, who shall live and who shall die, who by fire, who by water, in which it's very scary because we think about our own lives, obviously, but there are lines in that poem that also hint to and draw from imagery in the book of Ezekiel, a prophecy in which God calls all of the corrupt rulers to task in this sort of end of days judgment. And, in that image, well, I might not be being judged because I'm not the despotic ruler in that metaphor, But sure, there are a lot of, immoral leaders that I would like God to judge right now. And I would like God to step into history and take care of a few things. So, there is an aspect, even to the judging God, where there's Bayom Hahu, on that day, God is going to step in, judge the immoral, corrupt leaders, and set everything straight again. I don't think we object to judgment. I think we object to unfair judgment or, sort of super strict, irrational judgment. But a world in which, leaders are called to account for some of their immoral behavior, and that happens on a particular day, Rosh Hashanah. So, okay, we can get behind that, a day of moral accounting.
Right, I like that. So do you have a favorite Rosh Hashanah prayer? Is there one that you go every year oh, good, we're here now?
Yeah. So for me, I would say the truth is, when I think about the quintessential Rosh Hashanah moment, I think about the shofar.
Right.
And one of the things that I love about the shofar is the way in which the blasts themselves have different resonances and meaning. When you look at the blasts, just the sounds of the shofar in our Torah, there is a direct connection between certain sounds versus other sounds. I'll give you one example. When we do tikiyah, the long uninterrupted blast, in the Torah, as a sort of military sound, that was a signal to stay, camp, don't march. Whereas you have the broken up blast, that is we're going to get moving now. We're going to be marching. And I think so much of the interplay of the experience of the shofar sound is, am I still? Am I staying? Am I where I want to be? Or am I journeying? Am I moving? Am I moving to the next place? And part of what's a little bit disorienting around the shofar is the interplay between those sounds. You could imagine a world in which all we do on Rosh Hashanah is blow a single uninterrupted blast. We're here to stay. Or all we do is we're journeying, we're going to hear the multiple blasts there. And what we have is a balance and a mix. And I often found myself getting lost in those distinctions. Am I moving? Am I staying? One other aspect of the sound of the shofar, my colleague Rabbi Held is going to speak about, has spoken about, and is going to speak to your colleague Rabbi Cosgrove in a future series, speaks about the sound of the shofar as the tears of the mother of our enemy. I'll say what I mean by that. In the Talmud, they discuss, well, what is the sound of the shofar? And they come to this conclusion: it's a cry, like a weeping. And who's weeping in their imagination? It's the weeping of the mother of Sisera. Sisera was a general who fought the Jewish people in one of the ancient battles in the land of Israel. And the mother of Sisera is looking out the window. When is my son coming home? But he's been beaten by the Israelites. And so he never comes home. And when she realizes this, she cries. And so the sound of the shofar that we experience, maybe that broken up sound, is the sound of the weeping mother of our enemy. Now, I'm not taking away from, you want your enemies to be defeated, but also this experience of empathy with our enemy's mourning parent. It's also something that I think is very resonant in the shofar sound. So shofar, I think a lot of people connect to shofar just as a non-cognitive experience, but also to think about other multiple meanings of that sound is something that I like to explore on Rosh Hashanah.
Right, and even the name for it is shvarim, which means broken, right? So it's like it's like you think of broken heart, right? Like you think of broken, like the tears, but also like the brokenness of a broken heart. So.
That's right. One other piece I'll just say liturgically on Rosh Hashanah that I think is powerful is Elenu. Now, Elenu is a prayer that if you ever show up to any service in synagogue...
Like, yes, we got to Elenu,
right,
it's almost
exactly.
over.
Elenu's at the end, you can stop flipping through the Machzor.
Exactly.
It ended up in the Middle Ages showing up at the end of every Jewish prayer service, at least in Ashkenazi communities, but it originates actually on Rosh Hashanah as an introduction to the section of the Amida in which we call God King. Part of the powerful aspect to me of Elenu is the part in which we actually bow down and prostrate, where we bend our knees. And you think about bending your knees as actually getting on your knees, not just like a little bit of a nudge, but like you kneel down and you see sometimes the prayer service leaders are doing this only, but you sort of get down entirely like that. And what you're doing in that moment, I think, is just having an embodied experience of the presence of God. You know, imagine if you were before a king in an ancient world. You wouldn't just like sit in a pew and like kind of twiddle your thumbs. You would embody some greeting or acknowledgement of being in the presence of something holy and powerful. You know, when you think about being in the presence of world leaders, you know, you think about, well, you're not going to just sort of waltz in. You're going to enter in some way, and that might involve some sort of body submission. And that's what we get to do before God when we call God King on Rosh Hashanah. So I also, even if you're not actually getting on the ground yourself because of logistics or pews or whatever it is, to just experience the power of being in the presence, thinking about with your body how you want to reflect that moment is something that I also look forward to at Rosh Hashanah.
Yeah, and I have to say, as I've had the good fortune of being a prayer leader and experiencing it, and in some communities, people make room for everybody. And as a yoga practitioner, there's something about an embodied experience that resonates with me often. So there is something really amazing about that moment. And I do encourage people also to, even if there's not room, to just be super present in that moment and bow more deeply, bow with more intention, with more kavanah. Just imagine, you know, the ruler in front of you, or just like the humility, like just with an intention of humility, you know, like giving in, even if it's not God, even if it's not like the sovereign or king, whatever, but the fact that we are smaller and there's something much greater out there, and just like that moment of humility and humbleness.
Yeah, I think the decentering of our own ego is a big part of what high holidays can mean for us moderns. And I would also say that, going back to an earlier theme we spoke about, when you prostrate or even when you bow, you're actually moving towards. You're encountering, and I think about the scene in which Jacob is reconciled with his brother Esau, who he hadn't seen for a number of years, and Esau was out to kill Jacob at some point. When Jacob comes towards Esau as they reconcile, he prostrates towards his brother 7 times. And so moving your body forward is also a way of coming closer, reconciling, and that can be with God, that can be with other humans in your life, relationships that you want to repair. So there's something about the embodied nature of bending forward that I think is also a big part of what it means to experience the power of deepening and reconstructed relationships on Rosh Hashanah.
Amazing. So let's quickly flip to Yom Kippur. And so why don't you like sort of highlight 1 or 2 themes and maybe your favorite prayer or story from Yom Kippur?
Great. So Yom Kippur, the distinction, I would say, that is specific to Yom Kippur is essentially the confession, the vidui, the part where we bang our chest and recite an alphabetic, sometimes double alphabetic acrostic of sins that we have all committed. And that's really an expansion of what the Talmud is essentially boiling down to a very short phrase, which is, you must confess your sins on Yom Kippur. You have to do that. If you went through Yom Kippur and you didn't actually say, here's what I did wrong, you kind of missed the boat. And this is a day set aside, even though you can, and we liturgically do confess our sins every day. Yom Kippur is really the day in which, even if you didn't get that done during the year, today you're going to get it done. Now, for some people, that can sound a little sort of, I would say, non-modern, to like publicly confess your sins. But also, there's something powerful about saying, you know what, I'm human. We all have sins, and this is a time for me to connect to that part of who I am in the world. And it harkens back to the story of Joseph and his brothers. When Joseph's brothers sell Joseph into slavery, they commit one of the worst sins in the Torah. It's actually a capital offense to kidnap and sell somebody in the Torah. And when the brothers sort of understand that they're being punished for this, when they encounter Joseph later in the biblical story, they say, Aval Hashemim anachnu, we are in fact, in truth, we are guilty. That is a big moment of courage in which the brothers finally own up to their sins. But part of Jewish tradition is we're sinning, we're a sinning people, and we have to say that out loud and explicit. And so on Yom Kippur, that's the moment when you can say that out loud. And the other part of Yom Kippur liturgically is what we call slichot, the part in which we ask God for slicha, for forgiveness. Forgiveness is an odd concept because if you were living in a sort of a world of truth and fairness, you would never be forgiven. Forgiveness is something that happens only when my mercy conquers my judgment, my truthful side. No human could ever stand if they ultimately were being judged only on the aspect of truth. We're just imperfect, and so we would constantly be, on the outs. But the world of forgiveness, of slicha, slach lanu, forgive us, our God, is one in which we move from sort of an unearned level of forgiveness. I don't deserve to be forgiven, but I'm asking for it anyways. Yom Kippur sort of calendrically is meant to fall upon the moment in which the Jewish people are forgiven for the sin of the golden calf. We mentioned that a little bit earlier. There's no opportunity to forgive the Jewish people for that sin. I mean, just 40 days earlier, they got the Torah says, don't bow down to idols. And then boom, they're bowing down to an idol. So how can you excuse that? But it's a moment in which God says, if I'm going to have a relationship with humans, I need to forgive. And so that's part of what Yom Kippur ends up doing for us, is to say, I don't deserve to be forgiven, but I'm going to ask for forgiveness anyways. And of course, that's resonant, I think, for some of our human relationships as well. I don't deserve to be forgiven, but I'm asking for it anyways. Will you start over with me? Will you start again with me?
Which is I want to harken back because it's parallel to Ha'el HaGibor. Like, so like God acts in these ways in the world, and so we should. We're asking God for forgiveness, and that's how we should also act towards others and hope others act towards us. So for people who struggle with God or in relationship with God, it's also a reminder of how we're supposed to be in the world. And so I love looking at it from both ways, from the godliness, but also like what it means in terms of how we're supposed to walk forth.
Exactly. And I think your point about our role morally and religiously in the broadest way is to walk in God's ways.
Right.
And
right.
And love the widow and the orphan and the stranger,
yeah.
and forgive others who we want to be forgiven by our peers, and we have to model God's forgiveness to others as well. The other part of Yom Kippur that I would just highlight for me is the aspect of Yom Kippur we don't often connect to, which is the joyous part of Yom Kippur. And I don't know if they do this at Park Avenue. In some synagogues and in some religious communities, at the end of Yom Kippur, there's actually dancing that happens because we made it through. We're on the other side, and there's a joy that comes from being forgiven, from starting anew. Which actually bleeds over into the next holiday just a few days later on Sukkot, which is the day in which we sort of enact that joy in a more ritualized way. But Yom Kippur can be a happy day. I was just talking about this with my kids who were sort of saying, well, what do you mean it's a happy day? I thought it was a day of sadness and fasting. And that's true, and that is an aspect of Yom Kippur. But it was also the day in which, at least on Yom Kippur afternoon, love was in the air. People would go out, the Talmud reports that uncoupled people would find each other on Yom Kippur afternoon and pair off because it was a day of love. And it's the relationship aspect that we've been touching on again and again in this conversation, in which we are renewed. Think of after the forgiveness moment, you're more connected to the world and to your relationships there. And so Yom Kippur has this happy aspect to it. You think about that last shofar blast at the end that we're all so excited about, and thinking about the bagels and lox or however you break your fast. And there's something joyous in that blast of like a sort of a trumpeting, a heralding of the age and the moment that we've actually made it to. There's this concept that the day of Yom Kippur itself achieves forgiveness. Like if you make it to Yom Kippur, you've made it to forgiveness. And yes, we stand in prayer, and yes, we beat our chests, but there's also something just powerful about here we are. We made it to stand all together again this year, and that's something to celebrate.
Right.
So I want to leave people with some sense of Yom Kippur as a happy day as well.
So I have to say, as a day of love, I just have to put a personal note in that my parents met on Yom Kippur at services. So it certainly worked for them. But that sense of joy, so we think of Rosh Hashanah as the new year and the new beginning, but in a way, through Yom Kippur, we have gotten to this point where we've cleansed ourselves in a certain kind of way, and now it's really sort of a new beginning. So there's this logic, surprise, surprise, to the way the holidays fall.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think even if we're not tapping in every moment to the words of the prayer book, to just have the bigger themes floating around for us, hopefully in a deeper way this year, might give us some deeper experience.
Which you have helped us so much with, Rabbi Kaunfer. So we're so grateful for all you have brought, and I'm sure I'm really confident that people's high holiday experience will be different because you've given them so much to tap into. So we want to thank everyone for joining us this evening and to invite you to join us for the last of the three on Thursday, September 22nd, with Rabbi Shiheld and Rabbi Cosgrove. They're going to talk about the theology of the high holidays, and that one you can come in person or again watch live on Livestream, your PIS Connect, or any of our live channels. So thank you again. Thank you so much, Rabbi Kaunfer. I feel like we could go on for hours on so many more
leave
questions.
That to the liturgy,
right, exactly, exactly. And just want to wish everyone a Shana Tova Umetuka, a sweet, healthy, and happy year.